on. In any case, good evening. I'm Barbara Peters. I'm the owner of the Poison Pen, and it's really a pleasure to have a special program this evening with Leslie Klinger, Laura Caldwell, and Cleo. I'm sorry, I don't remember your last name.
Khalil Rashad.
Thank you. Who is an exoneree and whose story is a part of our program this evening. But I want to begin by all of you wishing Laura a happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. How lovely. I was wondering, I was like, look at her sidling up. She's just kind of hungry before she goes.
It looks like a snow cone, doesn't it?
So
But
sweet.
it's actually an HA cupcake special with, I assume,
Nice.
completely killer buttercream frosting that will probably send you into sugar shock and ruin this whole thing. In any case, Laura and Leslie are the editors of Anatomy of Innocence, and there are many distinguished contributors. Scott Turow wrote the introduction. Sarah Paretsky, Laurie King, who is here on a fairly regular basis, and many other authors each told a kind of chapter. So they will discuss the whole thing with you. Did you work with Michael Harvey? Because he wrote a really interesting book, a crime novel, which included the Innocence Project, which is at Northwestern, if I remember right, which is one of my alma maters.
Yes, and I'm proud to say they're giving me an award next Thursday for contributions to the innocent. But yes, Michael Harvey's part of the book, and he did an amazing piece. He's one of those good
He's
ones.
a remarkable guy.
Yeah.
But probably the most remarkable story you will hear tonight is in fact from Khalil. So I'm going to give him a microphone and step aside and let this program roll. Take it away, Leslie.
Thanks. Take it away, Laura.
Well, I did want to say thank you so much to Barbara for having us, and it's pretty fitting that we're here. This is our last event for Anatomy of Innocence. It came out in the spring, and it's very fitting that we're here with Barbara because Poison Pen, as most of you know, it's not only one of the most beloved, bookstores in your city, it's one of the most beloved bookstores in our country, and it's certainly revered and loved by mystery authors. And so, I mean, Barbara, I think, understands more than anybody the camaraderie and the generosity of this community, which is mystery and thriller writers. And the reason that this book came about was because of that. And really, without Barbara and people like you who've been so supportive of everybody in this book along their various careers and various paths and various books. So thank you very much. Much appreciated. I'm going to let Les kick things off. He's always good at introducing a couple stats and
Sure.
things, and then we're going to...
So this project came about. To understand this project, you need to understand a little bit about Laura, this amazing, dynamic woman here. So Laura, it's a long story. I'll give you the short version. Laura started a project called Life After Innocence at Loyola School of Law in Chicago, and wanted to find a way to involve the mystery community, our friends, basically, in supporting the activities of Life After Innocence and more broadly the Innocence Project. And she conceived the idea of a book that would have as contributors major mystery and thriller writers. When we went to our friends with the idea, we had to use a stick to sort of beat away some of the people who wanted to, I mean, everybody wanted to do this. And it was a wonderful support from the community because they all wanted to speak out on this crucial issue. The issue here that we're talking about is perhaps a subset of the bigger issue of mass incarcerations, which is not something we're really going to get into particularly tonight. This is about individuals who have been wrongfully convicted of a crime, done in many cases astonishing amounts of prison time for that crime, and ultimately been exonerated. Now, these are not people who were found, who were let go because some technicality came up, there was some legal error in the trial. These are people who were factually innocent of the crimes for which they were convicted and for which they served time. We have a system that basically, for decades, said that can't happen. It's a perfect legal system. the jury system, all of that. It's just got so many safeguards and the Constitution behind it. It can't possibly happen that an innocent person gets convicted. Well, in the last 30 years, especially with the advent of DNA, we're coming to the realization that not only can it happen, but it happens with some regularity. We're not sure of the exact numbers. Estimates range as high as 10%, perhaps 5% is a very reliable number. Now, first of all, I always like to say, be proud Americans. We have the largest prison population of any country in the world. 2.3 million people in our prisons. 1/3 of the imprisoned women in the world are imprisoned in the United States. So, if you use 2.3 million, that means over 100,000 people are in prison right now for crimes that they didn't commit. How does this happen? It happens because, as Laura will say more about later, this is a human system. It's a system, therefore, that makes mistakes. We have human law enforcement people, we have human prosecutors, human juries, human judges. Errors happen. So the main message of the book, to sort of cut to the conclusion first, what we want you to take away from what the stories you're going to hear tonight is be aware that what you read in the newspaper, what you see in the law books, what you see on a blotter of somebody's sentence isn't always the truth. Mistakes happen, and you need to question whether people have been honest, people have been forthright, and whether they've admitted the mistakes. We're not here to point fingers at prosecutors or law enforcement people. We're here to say, when there's a mistake, you need to fess up, and something needs to be done about it.
Well said. I'd like to introduce our special guest, Khalil Rushton, who's a Arizona exoneree. Really honored that you're here. Thank you very much. When we've been doing these events, we've been trying to involve a local exoneree so that you who live here can meet someone who's been through the ordeal of being wrongfully convicted, getting taken away from their life, and then, as we will discuss, sort of getting thrust back sometimes in a very surreal way. The point of this book, Anatomy of Innocence, Testimonies of the Wrongfully Convicted, the whole point, well, I would say there's 3 points. One is our intention was to get behind the soul, inside the skin, as best we can. No one will ever understand it but another exoneree. But as best we can, we wanted to say, what's that like? Not just false confessions are a problem, government misconduct is a problem. We wanted to say, what does it feel like? And I want to say, I'm going to introduce Khalil, but we're also honored to have Stephen May and his mother with us, another Arizona exoneree. So let me just tell you briefly about Khalil's case. By my estimate, there are about 3 or 4 of the main causes of wrongful convictions exist in Khalil's case. In Khalil's case, one of the major problems was prosecutorial misconduct. It's becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and a lot of times district courts or federal courts are very leery to call another attorney to the mat. Sure, they'll maybe say, maybe your defense counsel, but it's really rare to have them say, your prosecutor, and what they said was vindictive, completely out of bounds. So Khalil had, like many exonerees we know, the great misfortune to come upon a victim. And when the cops reached out to him, he said, sure, here's what happened. We know so many exonerees who've gone to the police department. I hear you think I was involved in a shooting. Hi, I'm here to talk to you about this. So many people actually offer themselves up to the police in hopes of clearing things up, in hopes of being honest and open. And a lot of times, if you were the one who happened to be there at a certain time, that's sometimes all people want to hear. And what we do know, and I think this is a human condition, is that once you've made a decision in your head, you will do everything you can to marshal the facts that way. So if in fact the cops or the prosecutors think it's you, which they did with Khalil, a murder occurred because of two people. Khalil came in, was very upfront with everyone what he saw, what happened, and essentially would not. He was asked by the prosecution to say things that were different, to try to force these facts the way they had decided on these other people. And when he wouldn't do it their way, so he thought he was a witness for all these years. And when he wouldn't do it their way, they said, "All right, we're coming after you, buddy. Do this, or we're coming after you." And he stood up for himself. And I want people who are parents here to think about this. When Khalil, you did 15 and a half years. When he went in, his daughter was 6. And when he came out, she was a mother and had a 5-year-old. So, in order to personalize it, he missed graduations, he missed her pregnancy, he missed birthday parties, and that is the kind of personal detail that we were trying to bring in with this book. So, you got out in 2011.
Correct.
And you've now been focusing your efforts sort of on the... Were you coming in with a question over there?
Oh, go ahead.
You look poised.
Oh, I'm always poised.
Well, I've got so many, like...
We can talk for about 3 hours
Yeah,
by the
really,
way, on this subject, so that's always a problem. Go ahead, please.
Well-
Khalil was about to tell us something about his experience.
What... You know, I hope you wouldn't mind if I jumped to the end, because Khalil and I were talking about this book. The other thing we did with the book was we wanted to give some kind of structure to... There was no average wrongful conviction, but Stephen can talk to a woman who was convicted of killing her husband, and they have very different cases, but they're going to have gone through similar stages. Everybody remembers the moment when, like, either somebody knocks on the door to talk to you, or it dawns on you, this is not going the way I thought. And so we try to start out and give those stages, and I wondered, what was the dawning moment for you when you thought, this is not, I'm not a witness anymore, this is going the wrong way?
So the dawning moment for me was, it came when the state, they wanted me to take polygraphs, they wanted to, I had a gun at the time, I turned it over, did ballistics, and all this was in the effort to clear myself. And the dawning moment came at a point where, because I was cooperating in order to clear myself, I started to receive threats from the alleged shooter. At that time, I took it to the prosecutor and said, hey, I'm receiving these threats. And they just nonchalantly like, hey, we don't believe you, or they deemed me as not credible. So, at that point, it was a eye-opener, like, they really didn't believe what I was telling them, or there was going to be some type of twist. I don't know. So I stopped cooperating. With me stop cooperating, and for them to turn around and charge me with a murder that they knew I didn't commit, that was kind of like the eye popping.
Yeah.
It was it was just unreal. But I guess it was even more unreal when they actually put the case together. They piecemealed a case, intimidated witnesses. It was just so much that I hate to say, but people ask me, and when I tell them that at one point in time they actually had me thinking I committed the crime,
Right.
because they put the case together so good, and I'm like, this is garbage, and I just knew it wouldn't stand up. So.
Can I say something about that? I think that's important to point out. If you're a sane person, and if everyone seems to think you did something, at some point you gut check yourself.
Right.
And you go, could I have... Maybe,
You start to question yourself. I mean, that's like, my mom always told me, if something's going wrong, find out what part you played in it. And it was just so unreal sitting in prison, and I'm kind of questioning myself.
And yet, I assume that I don't know how long the sentence was and whether you had opportunities for parole, but in talking to some of the other exonerees, there is that magic, that prize waiting there. You want parole? You want parole? You just have to speak up and say you're sorry for what you didn't really do,
right,
but you're sorry for what you did.
Right.
And how you hold it together and keep saying to yourself, I'm not going to just let it slide. I'm not going to give in. I don't believe those things they're saying. You did that.
And the biggest impact to all of that is I would still be sitting in prison. My parole date would have been 2021 had my case not been overturned. So, it's still to go back and think about the situation and to really try to have faith in the core of a criminal justice system when you see behind the scene it works differently. It's just so unreal. Like I said, my parole date would have been 2021, and that's going to ride on my back as a reminder every day.
Well, I wanted to say just another word about sort of what Laura was talking about, the structure of the book and how it came together. The reason that we ended up picking all these different people was because we wanted, they're wonderful storytellers, and we wanted them to amp up these stories and compress them into indelible moments. And I was just telling Laura that we did a panel on this at VoucherCon in Toronto, which Laura couldn't attend. Not only was the panel in tears, the audience was in tears.
Tell us why. Was it because they were talking about the relationship
they were
formed?
talking about the stories. They were telling the stories of the individuals and how they'd worked with them, and yes, the relationships. This is, I should be clear, we didn't say this part yet. This whole book was a non-profit project. It was conceived, the authors basically worked for nothing. Laura and I worked for essentially nothing, and the proceeds are all going to Life After Innocence and the Innocence Network. So we've been shameless out there. At VoucherCon I said, and here's what you can do best. Go buy about 5 copies of the book and give it to your friends. It was very unusual to have an entire panel at the Mystery Convention devoted to a single book. But once we explained what the book was about, they let us do it. People basically were telling the stories of the experiences that the exonerees went through, and different segments of the experience. Laurie King was talking about the trial, and this somewhat Kafkaesque experience of who is it that they're talking about? It's not me, I didn't do those things. Who are those witnesses talking about? Brad Parks and Sarah Weinman and Jamie Frevaletti and Gary Phillips talked about their cases, and everybody's just so moved, and moved by 2 parts of it. On the one hand, the horrible experiences of the exonerees, of going through this hell of prison, and living in limbo for those years with sort of life on hold. You're cut off from family, friends, and all that. And the second part is what remarkable, incredible people the exonerees are, that they basically kept it together all those years, had that flame burning inside them, that they knew the truth, they weren't going to let it destroy them, and that they would get through it and get out and get back into being alive. Keep fighting.
Can I ask you about that? Because we have one piece in the book that we had Jan Burke, who's a great...
I'm not going to cry, I'm going to try.
A great author, and she wrote with Alton Logan. Alton is one of the most famous exonerees in the world, actually, because he was accused of killing a Chicago cop, and 2 lawyers in town knew that he didn't do it. They knew that their client on another case did do it, but because of attorney-client privilege, they couldn't. So Alton went to jail for 26 years. They had their client author an affidavit, and when he died in prison, they came forward with the affidavit, and Alton was released. So we wanted a chapter in the book about how do you get through the days. And in particular, in Illinois prisons, it's kind of a fascinating time. Michael Harvey, who's Academy Award nominee and who's one of our writers, he's also the Emmy Award-winning producer of the Cold Case Files, and he was also the person for CBS who heard from Richard Speck. Does anyone remember Richard Speck?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody's boogeyman back then, right? He had killed 7 nurses, and the Illinois prison system was very interesting back then, and he had a videotape, he had drugs, he had all these things, and he took a long video of himself. He had grown breasts because he had gotten hormones, he had a pile of cocaine, he was having some fun with his boyfriend, and it was literally...
This is Richard Speck, not
This is
Michael
Richard
Harvey.
Speck, and he took the tape, he sent it to Michael Harvey, who was a journalist. Michael Harvey went to CBS, and CBS National ran it on a Monday morning, and the Illinois prison system did not know it was coming down the pike. So their lockdown was 2 years and 3 months. 2 years and 3 months, and they call it 23 and 1, 23 hours a day where you're in your cell by yourself, or your cellie, and 1 where you maybe get out, but really a lot of time. So for 2 years and 3 months, Alton Logan was in a cell with another man with a toilet, and we wanted him to tell about the trauma and the torture. And I remember Jan and I were on the phone with him, and he just kept saying, I see where you guys are going with this, but that's the time where I couldn't lose my mind. I had to, and I just wonder, how do you get through that?
So, I mean, you really have to dig deeper. You know, it's really getting to know yourself, your likes and dislikes. That's, you know, going into the system, the first few years, it wasn't real. You kind of question being there. And I talk about out-of-body experiences because you kind of look at yourself on the yard, but then you could either let it eat away at you, or you could start to fight back. And, you know, me fighting back was initially to start knowing myself. And like I said, my likes and dislikes. And really just work on bringing solutions, because I kept digesting the problem, and I was getting full because the magnitude or you know, the weight of the problem, kept digesting the problem, and I would think I had something accomplished at the end of the day, but I was just, you know, feasting on the problem. And when I started looking at ways to bring about solutions and get my case out there, and that's when, you know, it really started to change. But, you know, mainly,
I wondered if you had a similar experience to what I've heard from some exonerees, which is it's kind of a cool meditation technique. I think it was Alton Logan, actually, who first explained to me that, look, Laura, I realized at some point that I couldn't control what I wore, when I got up, when I ate, when I got to wash my face, when I got to jog, when I did anything. I got to make no decisions in my life except for the mental airspace in my head. And he said at some point, I knew me being all angry was not going to help the prosecutor, who should have known better, and the kid, it's not hurting them, you're only hurting you.
Correct. And you know, another part of that is there was times I had to have a really good imagination to occupy my time too, because you know, the choices are limited as to what you can eat. You know, you're going out to the same rec yard and the dormitory. So I started off at a 5-yard, where I was single man cell. So the 23 and 1 is a reality. And you have to, that's where you really have to know yourself. And I was reading like 700-page books in maybe 3 or 4 days, because that was my television. So when you go down to a 4-yard, a high medium security, you have a cellie, a cellmate. And at that point, you kind of have to move as a unit. So I worked during the day, come back, he worked in the evening. So we really, you know, you're looking at maybe a cell the size of your bathroom or a little bit smaller. And it's 2 people in there, and you have to make it work. Coming down to a medium yard, where you're in a dormitory setting, and there may be 30 people in an area probably no bigger than your living room, or a little bit bigger than your living room, and that's where all the chaos starts, because now you have to deal with multiple attitudes. So it took a lot to build that armor, because that's just in your housing area. And once you go out of the housing area, into the chow hall, into the yard, now you have to deal with maybe 570 people confined into an area probably no bigger than bigger than a baseball field, slightly bigger than a baseball field. It takes a lot. You have to really dig in and you know, be creative and occupy your time.
So maybe this is obvious, but you know, we've got 15 exonerees in the book. The National Registry of Exonerations is a little over 2,000 people now, starting in the 80s. Those are the ones who made it. How many of those 100,000 innocent in prison aren't going to make it? Didn't make it. They caved. They couldn't handle it. Their minds couldn't do it, and they just didn't get themselves out. They couldn't bring it together to do that.
It's a real point, because I've seen people come in and commit suicide, you know, and it's like you're talking to the guy, and you know, or you're in the kitchen working with him, and then you hear he went home and took all his heart medication, you know, and that's one of the bigger realities that people, you know, we try not to remember, because you know, now I look at the death penalty, and I know for a fact that with the introduction of DNA, you know, DNA testing, I know they executed innocent people, and it's just sad to even think about that, because that's not something that's talked about on the forefront, and you know, with all the psychological pressures that's put on while you're in prison. You know, I talk to mothers today who wonder, like, what's going on, because where we talk about rehabilitation, you know, people being released out of these situations worse than what they went in.
So why does this happen? That's a very complicated question, because there's lots of causes. And we've tried in various chapters in the book to cover different ones. One chapter, for example, is about false confessions. False confessions are a fact of life, that they happen with more frequency than you can possibly imagine. Why? Sometimes it's because of physical torture. Sometimes it's because of mental torture. Sometimes it's because we have a rule in this country that says the police are allowed to lie to a suspect. They can say to you, your partner confessed. We know you did it. And your partner, of course, said nothing at all about you being involved, because you weren't involved. So false confessions are a significant factor. Mistaken witness identifications. For 100 years, people said, oh, that's the gold standard. You know, somebody says, I saw Les holding that gun at the supermarket. Well, studies going back a long time show that that's one of the worst kinds of testimony, that witnesses constantly make mistakes. When we have lineups and identifications and interrogations, most states don't require even proper procedures, and they don't require videotaping. And New York has just started videotaping interrogations, and Illinois does too, to try and prevent some of that. So that's another cause. Bad science. We have a case in the book about a woman who was convicted for murdering a baby. She was accused, this is, a doctor testified that the only way the child could have died was if the woman had shaken the baby. It's known as shaken baby syndrome. He described the symptoms. He said it's the only possible way that these infants die. I've seen it many times before. She was the caregiver. Obviously, she killed the child. Well, later, the doctor finally said, well, I guess maybe that there really isn't any evidence that there's a shaken baby syndrome, that there, in fact, are many other ways that children can die and exhibit those kinds of symptoms. It's another example of bad science. We see the terrible crime lab stuff. I don't know that you've been reading the headlines here, but in other states where these, botched exams, fraudulent exams, corrupt medical examiners, that kind of science. And you have bad defense. Defense lawyers, the statistics are shocking. Defense lawyers showing up drunk, sleeping through the trials, totally inadequately prepared. Now, that's not all. Sometimes it's just they're vastly overworked. They're a public defender, they're a government employee, they have many more cases than they can possibly handle, and they have no time to prepare. And then there's prosecutorial misconduct.
Now, I'd like to touch on prosecutorial misconduct for a second, because in the innocence world, it's becoming more and more a thing that people want to talk about. Prosecutors, and I've got tons of friends who are prosecutors, and the grand majority of them are in it for the right reasons, but they have absolute immunity. Absolute immunity. There's good reason for this. Absolute immunity means you're immune from suit. You're immune from prosecution. You can't be called to the mat, usually. That's why we're talking about it being so rare in your case. One case that's very illustrative is, I'm sorry, Harry Connick Jr., but Harry Connick Sr., who I heard is a lovely man, but he also has quite a history of, he's the prosecutor in New Orleans, and he often shaded and pushed things where he wanted them to go. One gentleman named John Thompson sued him and said, you hid stuff, you made up stuff, you knew I wasn't there, and you buried it in a file, and the jury awarded him, I believe it was $15 million. It was upheld on the appellate level in Louisiana, went up to the Louisiana Supreme Court, and it was upheld, and then it went to the United States Supreme Court. And they said, the only way you can really have this kind of verdict is if you show a pattern of conduct. And here's this guy going, I was in Angola prison for 20 years. Here's what happened to me. I don't know what happened to everybody else. So that was overturned. John Thompson never got any money, even though the Supreme Court of the United States took judicial notice of misbehavior at the prosecutor level. So in general, prosecutors just really have a lot of latitude.
And that was pretty much similar what happened to me. I was released, filed suit, and a lot of attorneys didn't want to touch it because of that
Right.
ruling, because they knew they would have to dump a lot of resources in it, and it wasn't a guaranteed win. But it's just sad that the conduct was documented, and we're talking about law enforcement lying, getting caught in lies, prosecutors intimidate witnesses, the whole nine. And it was
There's a Colorado prosecutor who was shown last week. She was giving witnesses cars. She'd get a used car from somebody who was like, I don't want this car anymore. I can use it.
So why does this happen? It doesn't happen necessarily because these are evil police officers or evil prosecutors. In many cases it happens because they've developed what Michael Connolly calls tunnel vision. They've focused on a particular suspect, they're certain that they're right, and they're just going to get to the bottom line, which is put that person away. They're doing it for reasons that they think they're protecting the community. That's one kind of problem. Another kind of problem is simply the culture of winning. We have this sort of sports mentality, both among the police and the prosecutors, which is, it's not about whether justice was carried about. it's about your clearance rate. It's about whether you notched up another victory.
And we often see when prosecutors are about to run for office is when they'll charge somebody with a death penalty who gets out.
Correct.
I don't know if you heard about this case. I wrote, we were holding out for John Grisham to write the last chapter, and
But
John,
we got lucky and got Laura Caldwell
yeah, we
instead.
said, yeah. John Grisham is like his own industry, and he can't say yes or no without 12 other people weighing in. So I wrote the last chapter in the book about Juan Rivera, who I don't know if you met at the conference. Juan was wrongfully convicted 3 times of raping and murdering a beautiful little 11-year-old blonde girl in Waukegan named Holly Staker. Like literally her twin would have a ponytail on one side and she would wear a ponytail on the other side. They were identical, blonde, beautiful. Holly had her first babysitting job and was walking to go to this babysitting. One of the first times she was like not with her twin, and she was raped and murdered. The real person remains at large. We don't know who it is. The reason we know it's not Juan is because DNA showed it wasn't him. Now that was before he had so many alibis, and then DNA showed it wasn't him. And so the first thing the prosecutor on this case did was say, okay, let's think about this. DNA doesn't match. Okay, well, she's probably having consensual sex. To which her 11-year-old sister says, I've been with her for every moment of our lives, and we're not having sex. I wasn't having sex. They literally pushed this theory and convicted him the next time. Then Juan's case gets overturned again. Out he comes. They say, and this is literally, I think this problem is inability to admit you're wrong.
Right.
Wait till you guys hear this. So, the third time, they're stepping up for a status date. We're trying this guy again. Okay, here we go. Hi, Judge. Judge, the prosecutor says all of a sudden one day, we have some new evidence. Oh, we're kind of far down this road. What is that evidence? Well, they say, we were hanging out in the evidence locker, as we like to do. Just hanging out, looking around. And we found these shoes. And guess what? They're Juan Rivera's shoes, and they have Holly Staker's blood on them. To which Juan, who is a very stylish man, who can still laugh as this one can, Juan said he was going nuts because he's like, I would never wear those shoes. Those are awful. But meanwhile, he pushed it. He kept saying, those aren't my shoes, those aren't my shoes, those aren't my shoes. They were trying to say, Your Honor, we want some evidence about chain of custody. Where did this stuff come from? Finally, the prosecutor says, you know what? Oh, they send them out to be tested. And sure enough, Holly Staker's blood is on them. Juan continues to say, fine, but they're not my shoes. But then all of a sudden the prosecution says, you know, we don't need that. You don't need it. It seems like good evidence, counsel. No, Judge, we're not going to go with that. We now know they went to the autopsy fluids, took blood from the autopsy fluids that were taken from this little girl's body, and put them on a pair of shoes that were not manufactured in the United States until after the murder, and walked in and said, look at what we found. We know they did this. Guess what happened? Nothing.
Now, it isn't. So again, another sort of mindset here is, well, maybe the Juan Rivera suspect didn't do it, but he's guilty of something. So that's why we're going to prosecute him, because he's somebody that the community needs off the street.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that goes on in their heads here. Now, there's some good news on the prosecutorial side, which is that we're starting to see what they're calling conviction review units being built up in some of the prosecutor's office. I don't know if that's happening here.
Conviction integrity
Okay.
here.
And these are now so the idea is that the district attorney's office is looking at some of the convictions that they've gotten and wondering whether they've got the right person. The problem is, as Laura's pointed out many times, is that this is a self-audit. This is the DA looking at the DA's conduct, and guess what? Most of the time, they're not going to be critical. So, but it's
What
a
does that
start.
look like here?
It's a start.
Unless it's somebody they're trying to get rid of anyway.
Yeah.
You know, but if it's somebody popular, it's just, you know, the level of accountability where there's a conflict of interest at the beginning. You know, there needs to be independent review boards or whatever. But here, it's to tell you the truth, it's really all a joke to me, because if it's just that much misconduct there, they're not going to disclose that. You know, it'll get swept back up under the rug, and especially if somebody has been sitting in prison for 30 years for this misconduct. And then, you know, it surprises me that something like this, the courts will have a harmless error analysis for this misconduct, where you know, they weigh it to see if it would have changed the outcome of the trial. And you know, so
Let's talk about one more thing before we start questions, and that is compensation for the exonerees. Laura, do you want to explain the sort of national situation, or you want to tell us about what Arizona is doing?
So Arizona currently has no compensation laws in play. You know, in my situation, several other exonerees out here, outside of the exception of Ray Crone, you know, they're pretty much like you're burnt. And, you know, we've been trying to bring awareness to this issue because there has to be a level of accountability. And it's not to say, you know, these exonerees are just looking to hit the lottery or whatever, but, you know, in my instance, 15 and a half years, I can't get that back.
And not only that, you let's just remind everybody, first of all, you were lucky to get a job. Many people in prison don't get work, so they earn nothing. And second, you get no Social Security benefits, no credit for the time served on the outside. Of course, you missed your education.
Correct.
Did you get to go to college? No. You know, and those sorts of things. So it's not just about... And there are occasionally civil suits. I mean, I don't know how many. There's been maybe a half dozen successful civil rights suits, but those are really the exceptions.
Right.
And so there's, what, 30 states now? Is it more than that now that have a system? But the systems are a joke in most states.
Yeah. I mean, in compensation, to really not have it on the books in states like here, it just makes me feel like, you know, where we talked about the prosecutor just having free reign, especially when they see the misconduct.
Something that surprised me about you, though, you're in a state that doesn't compensate the innocent, and yet I was on some of your webpage, and maybe you'll tell us where to find you. But you were also, I saw you had like designed some shirts, and it was Arizona Pride. And I wondered why you still wanted to promote the state that...
Well, because the biggest thing is I will never... the people should represent the government, not the government represent the people. I mean, and people say, well, that's kind of backwards. To me, I found that there's some good people out here who just have the wrong information on these issues. So I pride myself right now with the work that I do with reentry. The company I put together is called Our World Universal, and I'm trying to, you know, use it as a platform for programs to educate the public and also assist people coming out of prison. Because
whether or not they're innocent, because you want to...
Correct. I mean, because it's back to my theory of bringing solutions to the table. And you know, at this point, my Arizona Pride, the shield I made is more of a social justice piece for everybody who's either experienced a wrongful conviction or who is being released and is sincere about changing their lives and moving forward. So,
you have one of those?
yes, I have.
You got to show us that.
So we do want to take some questions. Barbara would be unhappy if I didn't at least mention that there's this other book, by the way, that I
You have
wrote
a number of
that's
other books.
just coming out. It just came out. So, but that's not what we're here about tonight.
Give a
so.
plug, come on.
Well,
No,
it's
but
the new
let's
annotated.
talk
the
about
new annotated
Frankenstein for a
Frankenstein.
moment.
Yeah, talk about Frankenstein.
This was
Well-
actually a Frankenstein book for us because it never showed up.
Thank you for being diligent, Barbara.
Yes, I was
So,
indeed.
let me just say, I'll take 30 seconds to talk about this.
Yeah.
2018 is the 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein. And this is, I mean, Norton just made it a gorgeous book. It's the original 1818 text with about 1,000 footnotes, because that's what I do. And it compares in great detail the 1825 and the 1831 texts, and it's got hundreds of pictures and all kinds of good stuff. And it was a lot of fun to do, and I'm very proud of the book.
Leslie,
It
tell
is
them
gorgeous.
about the other ones, because it isn't just Frankenstein.
Well, behind us here we have the annotated H.P. Lovecraft. Barbara has some copies of the annotated Dracula. So if you're in a Halloween mood, you can scare the heck out of your friends by just carrying these books. They weigh so much.
It's like going to the gym.
It is. I like to think of it as an exercise program. I'm really impressed. You have all of those volumes there.
Well, I moved them off my lap.
Yes, I understand. Believe me, I get complaints about this. I can't read this in the bathroom, Les. And the Sherlock Holmes books are the worst,
Oh,
because
yeah,
that's
they're-
15 pounds. So, anyway, no, let me just sum up by saying this is Laura's baby. I mean, she came up with the core idea. She asked me to help. I was so proud to be involved in this. And at VoucherCon, without you there, we raised a toast to you for this book.
Thank you. Oh, good.
And in any event, we'll be happy to talk to you more. So ask away.
I'm going to intervene here. I don't know if we've made it really clear that Leslie and Laura are distinguished attorneys. And Leslie has become a noted bibliographer. He's actually a Sherlockian. He's much involved with the Baker Street Irregulars and a companion to Laurie King, and he's won many awards for all of this. While
Including
sort of
Edgar.
practicing law.
Yes.
And Laura is also, if I recall right, although I missed, I think, your first appearance, is also a novelist. So they are wearing more than one hat to be involved in all this, and I think that's really important. I wanted to ask Khalil, one of the techniques I think that can help you stay sane in your kind of situation is to think about journaling or writing your story. Is that something that you did or you're thinking of doing?
Ironically, I have a few legal boxes with things that I just haven't put them together yet. Yeah, because there were times there were some interesting stories and situations, and I was just like, you know what? Let me use this pencil and this paper to kind of go off on that journey. So, I do.
Name names, or are you kind of hamstrung?
I can. You mean as far as
The
within
prosecutors, the
Oh, yeah.
cops.
I mean, and it's public.
Okay.
The prosecutor's name was Ken Peasley, and he was actually first prosecutor disbarred in the country, I believe.
Yeah,
What
I was
Cole,
shocked
what
when I
got
read
you?
that.
What got you out?
Yeah.
How did you get sprung here?
So I ended up going to. I ended up having an evidentiary hearing in the federal courts, and at this evidentiary hearing, I was allowed to basically introduce evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, meaning, the lies and so on, and then also initially where I had given a statement as a witness, and then when they went to prosecute me, it was used as a confession. And there was there was an area where prior to the interrogation, we went to a parking lot where my rights wasn't given. I didn't know my rights. I was a kid at the time.
How old were you, Khalil?
I was at 19, about 18, 19 at the time. So, we went to this parking lot, and I was told that they needed everything that occurred, and then we were going to go to the police station to get do official interview. And they would figure out how I can stay involved without being in any trouble, and so on and so on. Well, that later came up because they didn't read me my rights and all of this. They made the parking lot discussion interview disappear. And for pretty much from 96 all the way till 2010, when I went to the evidentiary hearing, they denied it ever happened. So
When the prosecutor was disbarred, was it because of were there a number of cases, or was it your case primarily?
So this prosecutor, that's really where I talked about being blessed and lucky at the same time, because this same prosecutor had sent 3 guys to death row, and there was tons of misconduct found in their cases. Whenever you're sent to death row, there's a lot more attention to these individuals. So they found out the same prosecutor introduced, bogus testimony, intimidated witnesses, and those guys' cases were overturned, I think, twice. Almost similar to Juan's. At the same time this was going on, was about the same time my case was going on. So, when we made our claims, it's just sad to say while we were in the state, they just overlooked it and affirmed the convictions.
Sometimes it is just a matter of luck, and that reminds me that we have a wonderful chapter in the book written by, I'd like to say for us, but that's not quite the case, by Arthur Miller, the legendary playwright. And the title of the chapter is called Luck and the Death Sentence, and it's about the saving of a young man because the prosecutor dropped it on the golf course, and the new prosecutor who went through his files found in the file testimony by a state highway patrolman that the young man had been across town from where the murder was committed, the murder of which he'd been convicted. It was the murder of his mother, of which he'd been convicted, and that resulted in ultimately his release. And Miller's point is really what you were saying, Khalil, that how can we have a death sentence when justice can be affected by something like that? How can we have a death sentence where you can't say, we're sorry, we made a mistake?
But so it was pretty remarkable how we got this Arthur Miller piece.
Please tell that story.
Because this is the only unpublished Arthur Miller piece since his death. And we worked with the estate, and they were very lovely. But when we were doing this book, we wanted to have, here's a chapter on when you get accused, when you're listening to trial testimony, when you hear the guilty verdict, which everyone will just say is such a surreal moment, when you first go to prison, how you sometimes become your own lawyer, how sometimes you have to turn to other lawyers. And we wanted to have a chapter about the community and how sometimes it's not other lawyers or yourself. Sometimes the community has to get you out. And we were going to use the case of the West Memphis Three, where 3 boys who liked heavy metal were essentially convicted of murder because they liked heavy metal, and therefore they must be devil worshippers. So they pinned a case on them. Off they go, 1 to death row, 2 to regular, and Johnny Depp got on this case, Eddie Vedder got on this case. The Dixie Chicks, it was a lot of music folks, but it wasn't lawyers and it wasn't their own things. It was the community. We went to, and I had these dreams of Johnny Depp being one of our. We were going to ask either Johnny Depp or Eddie Vedder, so I was thinking, I'm going to edit Johnny Depp. And then we realized that these guys had essentially taken an Alford plea. In order to get out, they had finally taken another guilty plea just to get out. And we only wanted to use people in the book who'd been exonerated. So we kind of looked high and wide for like another community piece where the community gets you out. And we were finally just going to scrap the chapter altogether. And Rob Warden, who runs the Center on Wrongful Convictions in Chicago at Northwestern Law School, we were having lunch, and I was telling him about my dashed hopes of Johnny Depp writing a piece in the book, and he is just sitting there looking at me. He said, "You've got to come back to my office. You've got to come back to my office." And we go back to his office, and he just pulls out, he doesn't have any digital copies of it, he pulls out a letter typed by Arthur Miller's and signed by him saying, "I helped out this kid once. I'm still so taken by it. I wrote this piece. If it can ever be used in any way to support the innocent." So we reached out to his daughter and who was married to Daniel Day-Lewis. I was then thinking
Yes,
we were
you're
trying to
right.
get Daniel Day-Lewis. But they greenlighted it, and so I think we moved one comma, but technically we edited Arthur Miller.
That's
Yeah.
right.
We are Arthur Miller's editors. He's
So
up
let's-
turning in his grave.
Let's take questions here. So, or comments if you have your own stories to tell.
Khalil, does it ever help to shout out in court, like, I didn't do it, or are you...
Repeat the question. The question is, does it ever help to just shout out something in
Yeah.
court, like I didn't do it?
Yeah.
That would probably be a bad idea, fighting murder case,
Why?
because then, I mean, the
Fine.
more you do that, they start to question your sanity,
Oh.
and you know, I was more, you know, I was vocal, but then you have an attorney that's telling you, hey, don't worry about it, you'll be home in April.
Trust your
And that was April of '97. You know, I was sitting in the prison. I was arrested May 27th, 1996. Trial started in March. But then he said, hey, don't worry about it. By April, you'll be all right. So just kind of, you know.
You know, it's an interesting question though. The reason I got into this innocent stuff was because I represented a really lovely young man who's still a good friend of mine named Jovan Mosley, who was in a Cook County holding cell for 6 years without a trial. And he, in fact, did not get a public defender or any attorney for 5 months. He was in a jail for 5 months. And part of the reason was they would it was multiple defendant, they would march everybody up, shackled, there's different lawyers in the courtroom, different prosecutors, different PDs, and everything just moved so fast. Finally, it had been 5 months, and Jovan stood up in court and said, I don't have a lawyer! And the place just froze. And that was the only way that he got an attorney. Yeah. But in general, they're going to subdue you more if you act out more, because now you're just crazy.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering if the facts of the lawyerly misconduct are known and you still can't prosecute them, why can't bar associations get involved?
Oh, they can. And by the way, now you can't bring a civil suit. In California now is a criminal statute about prosecutorial.
Yeah, that's-
but the bar is pretty high. But certainly the lawyers can get disbarred. That's
You know, in the
doesn't
Juan
happen
Rivera
much.
case that I was talking about with the blood, that gentleman was actually not just barred, but he was asked to step down from the County Bar Association. I know, it's still...
Sounds like doctors covering for doctors.
Well,
It
there's
is.
some of that. There's some of that. Yes.
Right now, I'm Camille Tilley, and I have a daughter who was a new hire school nurse in 2004. And she was convicted, and now we are approaching 14 years in the system. And I took my sorrow, the tragedy in our once wonderful lives. She was living in a lovely place in a family neighborhood in Scottsdale. And I've tracked all of these characters, the prosecutors, the attorneys, the whole ball of wax. And that is all in paperwork all over. I've testified at the state legislature, and I've gotten all the way to Washington and been on the advisory board of the Center for Prosecutor Integrity. So I've been at the core of this prosecutor integrity thing. And the original book that came out, or report that came out of California, was in 2010. And that was done by Cookie Rodolphe and Maurice Posley, who are involved in the exoneration registry and everything else. I took that binder into Rick Romley's office at the time to say, look, this is what's going on. And it got buried, okay? But it got also passed around. So they all know. They've had the binder in the Attorney General's office. We've gone through working at getting Andrew Thomas disbarred, okay? Lisa Obashan disbarred. It took us as activists, and I'm talking about 24/7, to get to the bottom of what's been going on in Arizona. And it's the tip of the iceberg. They bragged about having 200,000 felony cases in one term in office here in Arizona, in Maricopa County, from 2005 to 2010. Okay? Now, do your 10% on it, do your 5%.
Well,
And here we are.
this is part of the whole mass
Yeah,
incarceration
it's a mess.
problem
It's
too.
very
I mean,
real in here.
You know, while we like putting people in prison, we don't like spending a lot of money on the justice system. So you have tremendous caseloads, tremendous pressure for plea bargaining, and plea bargaining is putting lots of innocent people away because they don't even get a chance to present their cases. But there's pressure to take, you know. Door number one is you'll do a short term.
And that's correct, because, you know, I was on the yard and I would see guys come in there, and, I mean, youngsters, 19, 20, 21, and they were like, hey, you know, I signed this plea. And there was always somebody on the yard who knew the law, and you signed this plea. And the plea was like double digits, 22 years, 24 years. And they were, you know, they started going through parts of the case and looking at the police reports. And it's like, did you do this? No, but I signed a plea because if I didn't sign this plea, they told me I'd be looking at, 900 years or whatever. You know, they throw this big number out. They scare these people. Into signing these pleas, send them to prison, and the reality doesn't sink in until they're there about maybe a couple years.
And remember, the people we're talking about, so yes, they're kids, they're innocent kids who have no experience with the justice system. So they just sort of go with the flow. That they don't know how to deal with it. So Barbara, how many more questions can we take
I have
here?
one.
You have one,
We've
okay.
been talking about prosecutors. What percentage of those that have been exonerated were represented by public defenders as opposed to hired counsel?
Don't know. But we do have some statistics in the book about how many cases involved inadequate defense. It's a significant number. The National Registry is University of Michigan and San Diego, a joint
UCF.
project.
University of California, Irvine. They
Yes,
just
Irvine,
redeposited all of that body of material at a dedication in March that I attended, and it's a phenomenal resource. They have over 2,000 cases of data that can be
Great.
used as a hardcore resource
And there's a
everybody.
website, there's a link in the book and other websites mentioned too.
And I will say about the book, we wanted to show what it was like to go through these stages as an exoneree. But what we also wanted to do was educate on some of these causes. And we also, at the end of each chapter, will tell you why this person got pulled in, how long they did, how they got out, because we recognize it is a tough book to read. And so we wanted to make sure that at least people understood, here's some of the contributing factors, here's the overall story, which, as you know, is huge.
Complex.
Yeah.
So this is a book that I tell people, be prepared to have your heart broken when you read these stories. I mean, they're just powerful, heart-wrenching stories. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Yes.
But since the overwhelming message from TV shows and movies is that the police and the prosecutors can do no wrong, have you done any work with Hollywood types to try to
Yes.
give them another way of looking at the world?
Johnny Depp?
I think there is a Johnny Depp. I'm curious, a show of hands, who's seen Making a Murderer?
Oh,
So there are Making a Murderer.
Conviction.
Is-
it was
Conviction.
There
Netflix,
are a
right?
fair amount of shows that are now
Yeah.
starting to show either someone who was innocent and who was kind of railroaded, or you're sort of led to ask, are they innocent or not? And so sometimes they're still tweaking the entertainment value, but at least it's...
And there are some high-profile celebrities involved with the whole mass incarceration issues and so on. Tim Robbins, Harry
John
Belafonte's
Legend,
daughter, I've
Michael
forgotten her
Moore,
name, her
Michael
first name.
Moore, John Legend,
So they're
Common.
it's not yet
Doing
a
great
chic,
work.
cool subject, but it's getting there.
Go ahead, did you have something else you want to
Yeah,
say?
I wanted to add on to that because, it's really grassroots. Like, I go out, I educate. There's so many people who come in who just want to hear the story However, I noticed that when they start to talk about the prosecutorial misconduct, and you kind of have to drag bones out of the closet. They don't want to do that because some of them feel that it's an attack on the integrity of the whole system, so they don't want to expose that. So
That's a very good point. And there's one aspect of this whole justice system that we haven't talked about, which is the jury. And my friend Marcia Clark, who, as you know, was a prosecutor, her Twitter handle is @MarciaClark, and who's been here many times, is engaged in a new project, which is educating people how to sit on a jury, how to listen to evidence, how to analyze evidence, because unfortunately, not only are there many people who are defendants who don't understand how, what's going on, there are loads of people who sit on juries who are really ill prepared to do that. And so Marcia is trying to attack this in part by getting jurors who will be much more active listeners and not be swayed by emotional arguments. I come to all of this from the personal injury bar, and I can tell you that much of the same sort of difficulty is rampant there. And I will end this by saying, because we've talked about compensation, it's an imperfect world in that the law is not able to give back the years that Khalil lost or to anyone who was convicted and exonerated. And similarly, in personal injury cases, you're not allowed to go and cut off the arm of the doctor who maimed you. Instead, that's the old system, that's the Judaic system way back, an eye for an eye. What they can offer you is money. And it's a really inadequate, in most ways, compensation, but it's the one they have. And the idea is that if you are awarded compensation, I'm a person who actually won a personal injury trial, largest award of its time. I have a paralyzed leg that arose from. And the same problem arises. Doctors don't want to testify against other doctors. It's a loaded system. But basically the idea is that they give you enough money, you can make a different kind of life for yourself, even if you are injured, which is the reason we have a bookstore.
I don't know that.
It too is a not-for-profit.
Yes, well, that's
I am the unsalaried CEO of this company, right, which is actually a multi-million-dollar operation, but I do it for fun. So my point is, I don't know, it won't benefit me directly. But my point is that the law is really not designed, to give people adequate compensation for time lost or for health lost or for many things. The only thing it really has to work with is some kind of monetary system, so that hoping that you will take whatever that is and make another life for you. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that there is no other adequate instrument available.
So when you hear in Arizona about Khalil trying to get compensation for the innocent, support it.
I am.
Right.
No, I definitely support it.
only
And then
fair.
you also hope
Yeah.
that
It's only
compensation will not only change your life, but also give you something to make your life more worth living.
Well, as Laura said up front, Barbara, thank you so much for letting us come tonight and talk
There's
about
another
this.
comment to
Please
make.
tell your friends not about buying the book, about the problem, the issues here.
Right.
in the reality of not being able to be compensated, my biggest loss through all of this was my mother. So
No amount of money will
right,
give you time with your mother.
She was diagnosed with cancer in 2007 while I was incarcerated. At the time of the evidentiary hearing, I actually had my attorney go to the Attorney General, and instead of going back to the evidentiary hearing, hey, just carve me out a plea that will equal time served because I wanted to see my mother. They agreed, but the state felt they didn't want to admit to the prosecutorial misconduct, and this won't be on the books. They didn't want to. They stood in court and said they didn't want to fall on their own sword. They went off the record, and that's what unraveled the plea. the stay was lifted on the evidentiary hearing, which this dragged along, I was able to fortunately be released December 20th, 2011. I seen my mom 4 times before she passed away. You know, it was kind of like a bittersweet, just for me to be able to see her one time and just apologize for all of this happening. The compensation is really not for me at this point. It's for other people who may go through this, and just to have that level of accountability. So,
Does the anger ever go away?
I mean, the thing about anger, it'll probably consume me more.
Yeah.
So I don't even go down that route. I guess the joy I get, I look at the joy factor in all of this is now I'm in a position to actually have a voice for those people who can't speak up for themselves at this point. I do a lot of reentry work right now, so and then you know the shirts. So I'm in projects. I'm engaged in projects.
What are the shirts running?
$20. Which I didn't want to interrupt, but I'll show the shirts because there's more. But you know, it's just I try to get myself involved in these type of projects, create avenues for other people, be that representative, that voice in the community. Get back to the old school mentality of actually walking people through things, being that coach or that mentor for them. So, you know, most people ask me, "Are you angry about this?" It just kind of, I shake my head still, like this could happen to anybody.
Right.
So,
Can we give Khalil a round of applause for that?
I'm going to buy a shirt for the store so that we can in fact display it with your books. But you know what? Our color is red.
Laura and I are going to be
I am
Let's
taking
make
the
color
red one.
coordinate.
Laura and I are going to be signing books.
Right.
Happy to talk some more.
Les has all these other books.
Giving away your microphone, Leslie. Laura and Leslie are also going to be speaking tomorrow. They're the lunch speakers for the Arizona. No, you two. I brought you in.